Welcome to the AskJunior Judgment Podcast. I'm Sarah Thompson, and joining me today is Michael Chen.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's topic.
That's right, Michael. Today we're going to be discussing a landmark case in Indian constitutional law, the Minerva Mills case of 1980. This case dealt with some fundamental questions about the power of Parliament to amend the Constitution and the relationship between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy.
Absolutely, Sarah. This case is considered one of the most important judgments in Indian constitutional history. It built upon the earlier Kesavananda Bharathi case and further developed the doctrine of the basic structure of the Constitution.
Before we get into the details of the case, maybe we should provide some context for our listeners about the Indian Constitution and its key features. What do you think, Michael?
That's a great idea, Sarah. The Indian Constitution, which came into effect in 1950, is one of the longest written constitutions in the world. It establishes India as a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic and provides a comprehensive framework for governance.
Right, and two key aspects of the Constitution that are central to the Minerva Mills case are the concepts of fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. Can you explain these a bit, Michael?
Certainly. Fundamental rights, enshrined in Part 3 of the Constitution, are justiciable rights that are enforceable in courts. They include rights like equality before the law, freedom of speech and expression, right to life and personal liberty, and so on. These rights are meant to protect individual freedoms and act as a check on government power.
And the directive principles.
The directive principles of state policy found in Part 4 of the Constitution are guidelines or principles that the state should keep in mind while making laws and policies. They're not enforceable in courts, but are considered fundamental in the governance of the country. They include things like promoting the welfare of the people, securing a social order based on justice, and working towards economic equality.
That's a great overview, Michael. Now let's get into the Minerva Mills case itself. The case arose from a challenge to the nationalization of Minerva Mills, a textile company, under the Sikh Textile Undertakings Nationalization Act of 1974.
That's right, Sarah. But the case went far beyond just the issue of nationalization. It became a battleground for testing the limits of Parliament's power to amend the Constitution, particularly in light of the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution, which had been passed in 1976 during the emergency period.
Can you explain what the 42nd Amendment did, Michael?
The 42nd Amendment made several significant changes to the Constitution. Two of the most controversial were the changes made to Article 31C and Article 368.
Article 31C was amended to give primacy to all directive principles over the fundamental rights guaranteed by Articles 14 and 19. This meant that any law made to implement any directive principle could not be challenged in court for violating these fundamental rights.
And what about the changes to Article 368?
Article 368, which deals with the power of Parliament to amend the Constitution, was amended to add two new clauses. Clause 4 stated that no amendment to the Constitution could be challenged in any court on any ground. Clause 5 declared that there would be no limitation on the constituent power of Parliament to amend the Constitution.
So essentially, these amendments were trying to give Parliament unlimited power to amend the Constitution and place the directive principles above fundamental rights. Is that correct?
That's exactly right, Michael. And this is where the concept of the basic structure of the Constitution, which had been established in the Kesavananda Bharathi case of 1973, became crucial.
Can you remind our listeners about the Basic Structure Doctrine, Sarah?
Of course. In the Kesavananda Bharathi case, the Supreme Court held that while Parliament has wide powers to amend the Constitution, it cannot amend the Constitution in a way that alters or destroys its basic structure or framework.
And what did the court consider to be part of this basic structure?
The court didn't provide an exhaustive list, but some of the features mentioned included the supremacy of the Constitution, republican and democratic form of government, secular character of the Constitution, separation of powers, federalism, and the mandate to build a welfare state contained in the directive principles of state policy.
So coming back to the Minerva Mills case, The key question was whether the 42nd Amendment, particularly the changes to Articles 31C and 368, violated this basic structure of the Constitution.
Exactly, Michael. And this is where the judgment gets really interesting. The court, in a 4-1 majority decision, struck down the amendments to both Article 31C and Article 368 as unconstitutional.
Let's break this down a bit. What did the court say about the amendment to Article 31C?
The court held that the amended Article 31C, by giving primacy to directive principles over fundamental rights, destroyed the harmony and balance between these two crucial parts of the Constitution. This harmony, the court said, was part of the basic structure of the Constitution.
That's fascinating. It seems the court was saying that both fundamental rights and directive principles are essential, and one can't be elevated above the other.
Precisely, Michael. The majority opinion delivered by Chief Justice Y.V. Chandrachud beautifully described fundamental rights and directive principles as the conscience of the Constitution, and said they together constitute the core of commitment to social revolution.
And what about the amendments to Article 368? How did the court view those?
The court was equally clear in striking down clauses 4 and 5 of Article 368. It held that these clauses were an attempt to confer unlimited amending power on Parliament and to eliminate judicial review of constitutional amendments. Both of these, the court said, were essential features of the basic structure of the Constitution.
So the court was essentially saying that Parliament can't give itself unlimited power to change the Constitution, and that the power of the courts to review constitutional amendments is a crucial check on this power.
That's right, Michael. The court emphasized that India has a controlled constitution where every organ of the state, including Parliament, derives its power from the Constitution and must act within the limits set by it. The power of judicial review to ensure this is a fundamental aspect of the constitutional scheme.
This is really profound stuff. It seems like the Minerva Mills case really cemented the idea that there are certain core principles of the Constitution that are beyond the reach of the amendment process.
Absolutely, Michael. And it's worth noting that this judgment came just a few years after the end of the emergency period in India, during which there had been attempts to concentrate power in the hands of the executive and parliament. So in many ways, this judgment was a reassertion of constitutional democracy and the rule of law.
That's a great point. It really puts the judgment in its historical context. Now, I'm curious about the dissenting opinion in this case. Was there one?
Yes, there was. Justice P.N. Bhagwati, while agreeing with the majority on striking down the amendments to Article 68, disagreed on Article 31C. He felt that giving primacy to directive principles over fundamental rights didn't violate the basic structure of the Constitution.
That's interesting. What was his reasoning?
Justice Bhagwati argued that directive principles and fundamental rights should be seen as complementary to each other, not in conflict. He felt that directive principles, which aim at bringing about a social and economic revolution, were equally important as fundamental rights, if not more so, for the vast majority of poor and deprived people in India.
So he was essentially arguing for a more flexible interpretation of the Basic Structure Doctrine, one that would allow for social and economic reforms.
That's a good way to put it, Michael. Justice Bhagwati was concerned that an overly rigid interpretation of fundamental rights could hinder the implementation of necessary social and economic reforms envisaged in the directive principles.
This really highlights the ongoing tension in constitutional interpretation between individual rights and social welfare, doesn't it?
Absolutely, Michael, and it's a tension that continues to this day in India and indeed in many other countries. How do we balance individual freedoms with the need for social and economic reforms? It's a question that courts and societies continue to grapple with.
Now, as we start to wrap up our discussion, could you summarize the key takeaways from the Minerva Mills case?
Certainly, Michael. I think there are 3 main points to highlight.
First, the case reaffirmed and strengthened the Basic Structure Doctrine. It made it clear that there are certain fundamental aspects of the Constitution that cannot be altered or destroyed.
It emphasized the importance of maintaining a balance between fundamental rights and directive principles. The court saw this balance as an essential feature of the Constitution.
Third, it reasserted the power of judicial review as a crucial check on legislative and executive power. The court made it clear that the judiciary has the power and duty to strike down even constitutional amendments if they violate the basic structure of the Constitution.
Those are excellent points, Michael. And I think it's worth noting how influential this judgment has been. It's been cited in numerous subsequent cases and has really shaped the development of constitutional law in India.
Absolutely, Sarah. The Minerva Mills case is considered a cornerstone of Indian constitutional jurisprudence. It's a testament to the role that the judiciary can play in safeguarding constitutional values and maintaining the delicate balance of power in a democracy.
Well, Michael, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. The Minerva Mills case touches on so many fundamental issues: the nature of constitutional democracy, the balance between different parts of the Constitution, the limits of governmental power, and the role of the judiciary in interpreting and safeguarding the Constitution.
It certainly does, Sarah. And I think it's a great example of how constitutional law isn't just about dry legal principles, but about the very foundations of how a society governs itself and balances competing interests and values.
Absolutely, Michael. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. We hope our listeners have found this discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. Thank you all for tuning in to the AskJunior Judgment Podcast.
And thank you, Sarah, for your insightful comments and questions. Until next time, everyone.
Goodbye, and keep thinking critically about the law and its role in society.